So hello, everyone. My name's Ray Marcotte, and I'm the reference librarian here at the Wyndham Public Library. And I host these author talks every third Wednesday of the month. So if you enjoy this sort of thing, somebody else is coming in. If you enjoy this sort of thing, you can always send me an email, and I'll send you the Zoom link. They're always on our Google Calendar on the Wyndham Public Library website. The next person I have is Bob Keyes. He's talking about the isolation artists, which is the pretty interesting and controversial artist, Robert Indiana. So that'll be on the third Wednesday on February 16th. Let's see. So my guest tonight is Catherine Gentile. Catherine's fiction received the Dana Award for short fiction. Her debut novel, The Quiet Roar of a Hummingbird, was awarded finalist status in the Eric Hoffer Novel Award for Excellence in Independent Publishing. Small Lies, a collection of short stories, was released in October of 2020. Her nonfiction covers a variety of topics and has appeared in Writer's Market, North Dakota Quarterly, Down East, and Maine Magazine. She currently edits and publishes a monthly e-zine entitled Together with Alzheimer's, which has subscribers throughout the United States. Catherine is a native of Hartford, Connecticut, but she now lives on a small island off the coast of Maine with her husband and muse. Her latest novel is called Sunday's Orphan, and it was published in September of 2021. And you can learn more at www.catherinegentile.com. And I'm going to give it over to Catherine to start, and then we can sort of let it flow from there. Okay. So welcome.
Thank you, Ray. Thank you, everyone, for being here, for joining me, my support people from Connecticut and from Maine. It's just lovely to have everyone here. I'm going to read a couple of just a couple pages in two sections of the book, Sunday's Orphan, just to give you a sense of who these characters are. The book is set in 1930 in Georgia, so we're looking at a time of high racial tension, and the characters, I will identify who belongs to which race, which we don't usually do, but in 1930 was very typical for people to do and think that way. So this first reading, I'm going to introduce major characters of a gentleman named Fletch, his mother, Mother Hart, and the adopted son of Mother Hart, who is Trivet, which Fletch's half-brother or adopted brother. And these three are Negroes, Black people. And it's important to know also that Mother Hart's husband, Will, was a white man. So you can imagine the tension that must have promoted at that time in their lives. This is from chapter 4. The faded yet insistent letters on the sign for the Martinsville Monitor reflected the town's atmosphere as Fletch drove through the business district. Next door, in the storefront window of Lat's Dry Goods, propped against an off-center pyramid of Clabber Girl baking powder, a new misspelled poster beckoned special sale, wits only, WHITS. Across the street, a notice at Citizens Savings Bank overshadowed the dubious enticement in Mr. Lat's window. Gathered by the bank's somber locked doors, a crowd read the posting of reduced banking hours, 9 to 11, Mondays only. They're closing the lid on our coffins, one man muttered. Others nodded and wandered off, their once confident footsteps drained of swagger. Had Fletch been allowed to stroll this section of Martinsville, his footsteps would have faltered too, for reasons of a different sort. Now, as the sheriff's car came into view, Fletch hunched in an attempt to appear smaller, but there was no hiding the fact he was higher up in his wagon than the sheriff in his car would ever be. To make matters worse, the small natural upturn at the corners of his mouth made him look as though he thought the sheriff funny. Since Taylor's death, not much about white folks was amusing, and he didn't want the sheriff assuming offense when none was intended. He wanted to urge Cassiopeia, his mule, to move quickly from the gas station, but held her at a pace befitting a black man who meant no harm and had no reason to run. One gentle shake of the reins, and his wagon soon passed the Redemption Baptist Church, where pale ladies in clean dresses and country hats, an occasional bundle in tow, hurried across the street. "Town's in a jitter today," Fletch said. "You can feel it in the air." His mother sat still as death on the seat beside him, her evenly pinned gray braids shifting with the sway of the wagon. "Everyone's heard about the arrest," she whispered. Miss Mattie's seamstress shop, the first Negro business on the other side of the church, came into view. Ma'am gripped the bench, leaned forward, and nodded discreetly in the direction of the incident. There. Her eyes locked on the lacy handkerchief still lying on the uneven section of walkway where the woman had tripped. Ma'am's voice became indignant. "We both wanted to help, for goodness sake. It was only natural. After all, a woman fell right in front of our eyes. It shouldn't have mattered that she was white, but it does. It always does. I held back, but Trivet," she swiped at the air with her fist. We were walking several feet behind the woman, watching her struggle with her purchases. No sooner did she manage to get one parcel tucked under her elbow than the other slipped away. Next thing we knew, she was shifting her packages from arm to arm across her swollen belly. That brown wrapping paper kept on crinkling and crying as though the babe inside of her was kicking, warning her to slow down. And just as I got to thinking she was about to unleash a storm, she jammed the toe of her shoe smack crack against those uneven boards. Oh dear. Ma'am clasped her cheeks as though Trivet and the woman were right there on the ground in front of Fletch's wagon. All poor Trivet had to hear was "my baby," what with his Elizabeth being in the same way. And the next thing I knew, there he was, one gentle brown hand steadying the woman and the other helping her up. She was leaning on him and thanking him, telling him she didn't know what she would have done without him. That's when another white woman came along and started beating him off, as though he'd been doing the pregnant woman an injustice. By now, Ma'am's hands, folded one on top of the other, shook. Fletch rested his hand on hers, brought them to stillness. She trembled with a silent sob, the same hideous sound she'd made the night the men dragged his father away, then caught herself and sat upright. They'd never have arrested Trivet if Taylor were alive. Folks like us don't belong in Martinsville anymore. Ma'am studied his face. What are you saying, son? You're not leaving now, are you? Too many bad things are happening. You in some trouble I should know about? With Trivet in jail, we're all in trouble. More than you know. And then I'm going to move on just for a little bit to, where's this, chapter 14, a bit forward in the book here. And I want to introduce Promise to you, who is a white woman, 20-year-old white woman who's inherited the plantation from her adoptive uncle Taylor. So Promise and Mother Hart and Taylor are going to be together. That evening, when Mother Hart joined them in the cabin to make their supper, Taylor insisted over Promise's tearful protests that he tell her right then and there. As naked as Promise had been in the barn with Taylor, now with her offense fully exposed, she felt more naked than ever. For she'd done the unconscionable. She'd endangered Fletch's life. She braced herself for the humiliation, which she fully deserved, and not sensing the outrage she'd expected from Mother Hart, turned toward Taylor, who nodded her in Mother's direction. Promise took a shaky breath and forced herself to absorb the anguish in Mother Hart's eyes. I always thought I was plenty smart, that I could sort out complications, but standing here right now, I'm not sure what I know and what I don't know, that my thoughtlessness, I'm not sure what I know and don't know, other than I could have done Fletch unforgivable harm, and that my thoughtlessness has caused you hideous pain. Her words hit the air, and Mother Hart withdrew her gaze to the floor. Without uttering a word, Mother agreed that, yes, she chanced putting Fletch's life at risk, and that she had disturbed Mother's memories, most likely of Will Hart's horrific murder. Promise drew her shoulders up to her ears, and her jaw dropped open. I'm sorry, so very sorry. I should never have let things go that far. She searched Mother's eyelids for a flicker, her hand to wipe the perspiration dotting her upper lip, for a sign that a generous heart was softening. But she stood stone still. Just as she was about to go on, Mother interrupted. You're some headstrong, all right, Miss Promise Mears Crawford, always have been, and no one is about to say you've done right. But my foolish Fletch is as much to blame as you. My boy should have known better. He was by my side the night they took his father. He witnessed the devil's handiwork. She paused, giving her words time to swell with intensity, then peered into Promise's eyes. You do understand what I'm driving at, don't you, Promise? Women like us can be tricked into making way for the devil's handiwork, into unlocking hatred's doors, kicking them wide open. She broke her gaze and took a deep breath, as though to rein in anything hurtful she might mistakenly say. From then on, Mother measured her words, relegated them to the realm of the necessary. Without the closeness Promise once took for granted, she seemed to no longer exist in Mother's eyes. Someone else had died. This time it was her.
Thank you. So Catherine, what inspired you to write this novel, Sunday's Orphan? It's not a romance. It's a pretty heavy book. It's really wonderfully written.
Thank you. Thank you. I started this many, many years ago, probably over 20 years ago, and it was a short story, what they called a long short story back then. It was 10,000 words, and it was published in a literary journal called The Long Story. Subsequent to its publication, I received a phone call from a very prominent agent in New York, a literary agent, wanting to know if there was a novel that went with the story. And of course, I wish I had been able to say, oh yeah, I've got a novel waiting for you. I was waiting for this call, but I didn't. And I said, I don't, but I will. So he thrust me from, I wasn't quite ready to start working on novels at that point, but I just felt the impetus to move ahead. And so I started working on it, and it has been around for a number of years. It took a number of years to finish the book. What got me started on it? The agent got me started on moving from this being a short story about racial prejudice to a novel. And the other thing that got the story started was I've had a long-standing interest in racism and how it's come to be part of our lives, particularly here in the United States. I grew up in Hartford, Connecticut as a young child, and would go to public swimming pools and swim side by side as a little kid with Black kids. And just as little kids will do, we looked at each other and we'd say, well, how come your hair is so curly? Or how come your hair is so straight? Or how come your skin's so dark? How come your skin's so light? And I remember going home to my dad, who was an artist, and saying to him, well, how come their skin is so dark? Not that it meant anything to me in terms of it just meant that I was making an observation. And he responded, I thought rather nicely. He said, because the pigmentation in the skin is a little different. They have different pigments than you do. So to me, it was not a big deal. I got no sense that this was an issue or anything like that. And I think I carried that with me. And as I went through school, I had friends who were Black, and we never really thought too much about it until we started nationally having major issues. And I've just followed the concept all my life and still wonder why we as human beings like to separate people into groups, and why we have to have a pecking order. So it's been something that fascinates me. And I was down in Georgia vacationing, and saw the interactions with people down there who are Black and white. And now in this day and age, we see Black and white people together all the time. But back then in 1930, it was a huge deal. And it was a huge political deal. And it's just fascinating. So one thing led to another, and I started doing research, and eventually the novel came together. Long story.
Yeah, no, great. Thank you. I have some other questions as well, but does anyone have any specific questions they want to ask? If so, you can unmute yourself and ask away. Anyone at all? Well, I can go forward. So what about a little more broadly though? Can you tell us about your path to becoming a writer? Have you always wanted to be a writer? Have you dabbled in it for years?
Yeah, I think I've always been a writer. And I probably didn't discover I was a writer that was really a part of me until later in life. I mean, you grow up, and I don't recall as a young person way back when I was in school, people talking about writing as a way of making a living. And in retrospect, I knew that people were doing it, of course, but it was something that a few people did, authors, celebrated authors, that type of thing. But I never, being rather pragmatic, I never saw the possibilities for being able to make a living or anything like that in writing. But I've always written. I mean, I wrote stories as a kid. I wrote a play as a kid. Written a couple of plays. I mean, I had a play actually produced when I was in 8th grade, which when I think about it is embarrassing because it was a hideous little play. But you know, the teacher was very supportive, and so were my classmates. And I've kept diaries all these years. And later on in life, I began to realize that it was just something I've always done, and I needed to start to develop a little bit. And I went back to school and studied writing formally.
And you've written a couple other items. I know is it The Roar of the Hummingbird?
The Quiet Roar of a Hummingbird. Yeah, that was that's a fictionalized version of the experience my family had with my mom, who suffered from Alzheimer's for 13 years. So that was the story. It's not the verbatim story, but it was certainly based on our experiences, and hopefully help give some information when very little information was available about the disease. And the short stories were stories that I've written over the years. I collected them in a book called Small Lies. And part of my writing experience was practicing and learning with short stories, figuring that if I could manage 20 pages, then I could add 40 and so forth and so on, and eventually get to a novel. So they were initial writing experiences for me, but very formative.
Okay, great. Again, I want to give anyone the opportunity. Phyllis?
I'm just thinking, because I've had the pleasure of reading several of your books, about the Hummingbird book is very much about your personal experience. The short stories amazed me because each one was on some kind of whole different setting where I thought, how does she know about all these things? And what kind of research you do. And here we have a book that is not all about your experience, except to the extent that you had friendships with African American people in your youth. And I think it must take some nerve to dive into a history that's so much about racial relationships at a time that was different from our own. And I guess my question is, how do you do it to go into all these situations and places that are not familiar to you?
Well, thanks for asking that, Phyllis. I suppose I can say a lot of research and probably tuning into my compassion button. It's very interesting. My husband and I were talking about this last night. The Sunday's Orphan, when I think about the story and I think about the gestalt of the story, there are many things, you're absolutely correct, that are so particular to that era that required a tremendous amount of research. I mean, even the language that people used, I had to be careful which words I used. You know, some words we use now that were not used in 1930s. Some ways of thinking that we have now were not reflected back in 1930 in their language. So it was I had to be very cautious. But when I think about, again, the gestalt, I think about the things that make us human beings. And what do we have in common? I mean, we have government structures, we have sociological structures. I mean, we have places to get food, we have places to get shelter, we have people who are healers, we have people who are divisive individuals, we have common citizens. So there were a lot of things that I could look at that we have here in our lives today and look back and at least have some comfort level that those structures were in place. Even with the short stories, I've always been interested in different cultures and have done some traveling, never all the traveling that I would like to do, but I've done some traveling. And just to think about the research and to think about how these people live and the constructs that make their culture unique from ours, it always fascinates me. So I think perhaps that natural interest just engages me and it allows me a reason to go delving into stories, other stories, data that's online, contacting people directly and pulling that together. So I hope that helps.
I have a question.
Hello, Richard.
Hi, Kathy. How are you?
I'm good. Haven't seen you in a long time.
I know, it's been a while.
Yeah.
Hey, I loved your books, all of them, but I had a question. I was curious about your process. Do you do an outline first? Do you just let it come as you write? What is your process in writing?
Thanks for asking that. It's very organic. And I would say organic and chaotic. I was going back this afternoon through some of my files so that I could just pull data together for this evening. And I realized, I had forgotten about this, but I realized when I was starting writing Sunday's Orphan, I didn't know whose point of view I would use. And I wrote it from every person's point of view in the book, just about, to try to figure out what who would be the best, who would be the most representative person to be the protagonist. And it took me a long time to figure that out. And once I figured it out, then it became organic in that I wrote from situation to situation and kind of had to follow a common sense pattern. You know, if X happens, then Y necessarily has to happen. And then we have X, Y, and Z problems come up as a result. So one thing led to another, but it was a tad chaotic, Richard. Yeah.
Anybody else? It's definitely, I want to say, because I read the novel, it's a complex novel. I mean, there's a lot going on. So you did a really nice job as to, to keep the reader engaged and sort of like, well, how is that person related to that person? And because there's lots of those questions throughout the book, which is central to what's going on.
Yes, yes. It's interesting when you're writing about a community. I mean, I felt that I couldn't write about one person without writing about the next person next door. I mean, that community was so tight and so involved with one another that I just couldn't separate them out. So hence the number of characters.
Mhm. I have a question about setting. The novel takes place on the Barrier Islands off the coast of Georgia. How important is setting to your writing? I know you live on a small island yourself.
I do. Well, setting is crucial. I mean, an island can isolate people and it can insulate people. And this is what the island in Georgia did. It was not an island in the geographic sense that we think of a New England island. Where I live, there's water all around us. And yes, there's a bridge connecting us to the mainland, but there's water all around the body of land. And it's significant water. I mean, we have boats and we have barges going through all the time. It was not so in Georgia. And if people have been there, this is right outside of Savannah, and the Barrier Islands are actually flat pieces of land that have kind of rivulets around them, if you will. I mean, they're not huge bodies of water, but there is water all around these bodies of land, so it makes them into islands. And you'll travel over a tiny bridge and you won't know you've moved from the mainland to an island. But for purposes of the setting of Sunday's Orphan, it was very much an island. It was outside of town, outside of Martinsville, and certainly outside of Savannah. And it isolated folks, and it allowed Taylor Crawford, who was the character who had just passed before the book started, but whose presence continued to exert a rather dominating effect. And it allowed him to create this rather idealistic society where, in the midst of the Jim Crow era, where Black and white could live side by side peacefully, and where he could share his knowledge and his skills with those people and give them jobs. And people worked cooperatively. So it was a very isolated community that protected him and allowed him time to kind of foster this crazy notion that everybody could live together in peace.
Thank you. Does anyone have any other specific questions? No? Let's see, what do I got here? If I asked you about the title of the book, Sunday's Orphan, is that sort of a spoiler for people who haven't read it?
Well, it could be, but I think we could probably talk about it. I mean, Promise, who is the protagonist, is at the onset of the story is an orphan. And part of her major issue and her major thrust is finding out who she is, which is not uncommon for somebody who is an orphan. Finding out about one's history is very important. And it was significant for her. And it's significant in the story because the entire story revolves around keeping all the information from her. And Promise, as a bright young woman who has been taught by Taylor to investigate and to examine data before she comes to any conclusions about what's going on in her world, sets up the situation to keep information from her, but at the same time teaches her how to find information and how to evaluate it. So he's given her a set of skills, and she realizes ultimately that there was a real reason that he gave her these skills. And the book, as it unfolds, is her process of finding out what was going on and the whys and wherefores and all the little tidbits that, you know, she could have said, gee, this is just not true because no one would lie to me about my history. But she began to realize that, yes, there was a lot of lying going on. There are a lot of mistruths. And it was her responsibility to figure out what was going on.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that's sufficiently vague.
Yeah. And I understand. I wasn't even going to ask that, but
Okay.
what do you hope readers to take away from the story?
Well, I think when I think about the characters in the story, I think about people being healers. Promise herself was a healer. She was particularly adept at healing animals that had been abused or had undergone some sort of trauma or damage. She was very good with working with horses that were untamed, and she brought them into a better place so they could work on farms and so forth. Mother Hart certainly was a healer. She delivered babies. She was the midwife for the area. And she was a healer in the sense that she brought Black and white people together. Black and white women relied on her for delivering their children and for keeping them healthy. Not only did she deliver, but she helped when people were ill. So we have those healers, and her son, Mother Hart's son, Fletch, is on his way to medical school, which was part of Taylor's plan to get him, this very bright man, off to medical school where he could learn a trade and come back and be a healer for the area people in Martinsville area. So those people are healers. And in the sense that Taylor brought people together, he also was a healer. So he was a Reverend Taylor, a graduate from Harvard Divinity School. And he kind of saw this as his purpose in life. And then we have the people who are the divisive people, terribly divisive, people who separate people into categories and do everything they can to misrepresent them. And that would, of course, be Daffron, who's the antagonist, and his cronies. So when I look at those two, I look at bringing people together and separating them. And I think the message that I got anyway from Promise and everything she went through and her process was that ultimately, despite all that happens and all that happened to her and her, the people on her plantation, no matter how bad it was, the good kept on popping up in very small ways, but it kept on emerging. And I think ultimately she made an instinctual decision to err on the side of mercy versus continuing to propagate the violence that Daffron Mears was propagating. And I think that's the message. I think that every little act that we do as individuals that promotes some good happening. I mean, it could be as insignificant as a smile to a major act of something social or political. Every act has a consequence and it moves us forward. And I think that for us, it's just a matter of maintaining a balanced view of not getting discouraged. And I think Promise in her epilogue showed us that she never became famous. I don't think that was her intention, but she did have a family of children that did good things. And she married a Black veterinarian, and all those children suffered the consequences that many Black families and kids do. And years later, we've seen this, seen the violence and so forth that occurs. And those kids suffered, but they made it through and they found the good in what had happened. And they were good people and they went forward that way. And I think she could, that's her message, that yeah, all the bad stuff happens, but the good stuff happens too.
What was the epilogue? Did you write that in sort of in conjunction with your editors, or was that something you were already going to do?
No, it's something that I decided to do. Again, it was an organic process. I at one time had written the epilogue and then was going to go backwards and have the story as a flashback, and the old woman promise as the 90-plus-year-old woman reflecting back on all these things that happened. And I just didn't like the way it was working out. And I liked the fact that the end of her life turned out to be so productive in terms of good things happening, despite having this rather traumatic young life. So I flipped it around.
Yeah.
So it was there. It was there.
It's effective. I thought it was great.
Thank you.
Anyone have any questions? Any specific questions?
So maybe
go
I
ahead.
could ask, I mean, I know a couple of people
Yep.
have read the book. I would just wonder what your take on what was the turning point for Promise? I mean, what happened that clicked for her or did not click?
Those who have read that, Richard, you read it, or?
Yes, I did. I'm trying to figure out how to say this without giving away anything.
I know it's the hard part, isn't it?
The conversation she had where she started to learn her history. I thought that at that point, she obviously became more curious. Yeah, I don't know what else to say that would give it away.
Okay. It's an awkward question. I'm sorry. Thank you, Richard. That was helpful.
I'll add that in terms of Promise, it wasn't you didn't make it, incredibly clear. You kind of kept the reader guessing. It's like, well, what is going on here, and how is she related to that person? And so it kept you wanting to know more. Yeah, it was well done. I
think that's the reason I just couldn't put it down. I wanted to find out at the end of the day what was the secret.
Yeah.
Thank you. I had a few neighbors come over and jokingly complain about not being able to go to sleep at night until they actually finished the book. And one person said, I'm not a fiction reader. I'm really a nonfiction person. And I couldn't put the book down. And I decided I had to go to bed. And then at 3 o'clock in the morning, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to get up and finish the book. So It was kind of a backhanded thing that came through, but it was funny.
That's great. Can you tell us what you're working on now? Or are you working on other writings?
I am. I'm working on a couple of things. Number one, I'm doing an audio version of Sunday's Orphan, which is a new project for me.
You're reading it?
Yes.
Wow.
And entirely new. So I'm not quite sure. I probably shouldn't talk about it because I'm not quite sure that it's going to actually fly, but we'll see. Audio is new to me. I know it's been around for a long time, but for me, everything about it's new and it's kind of fascinating. So that's a piece that I'm working on. And I'm also working on a nonfiction, and that is a compilation of a lot of the work I've done in the Alzheimer's arena, putting together a lot of information that I've gathered into chunks that will be available to caregivers. So readily accessible pieces of information. I'm not quite sure whether it will be, what format it will be, but I'm working on pulling that together. I have 8 years of research to pull together, so that's helpful. And the other thing that I'm looking at is finishing off a story I started years ago about a young man who is the product of the Japanese internment camps here in the United States. You start to get the theme of the things I'm interested in, but I have something that I'm working on in that arena. So that should be interesting too.
Wow. So you like the historical research? Yeah.
I do. You know,
Yeah.
I find it fascinating. I love history and the research. I mean, writing, I love writing fiction, and the research just brings it all alive for me, and it gives me an excuse to go pawing through things. The downside of doing research, of course, is that you get embroiled in doing the research. And as a writer, I did a ton more research than I needed for Sunday's Orphan. And that's what happens. You become just so absorbed by it. But that's the joy of doing it too. And going someplace and saying, I'm writing a book, and would you answer this question for me? It's remarkable how many people just open their doors and open their hearts and share tons of information with you. So
Great.
I really do enjoy that. Yes.
Pete?
Kathy, will your
did you
audio
go-
version of it be on Audible?
I don't know yet, Betty. I don't even know how to put it on Audible or any of those things. So I have to find out more about it.
All right. Well, because we love to listen to Audible when we're traveling from Connecticut to Maine. And
Yep.
I read your book, and your book was great, but I'd love to listen to it too.
Oh, super. Well, thank you. I'll certainly keep you informed. I'll let you know, or I may tap into you for some information about Audible. I am really so green in this area. So
Good.
yeah, it'll be fun to explore it.
Great.
Thanks.
I had a quick question. Did you go to Georgia, the Barrier Islands, and spend time there at all?
I think that's what started, what got me really interested in writing the story. You know how people come up to Maine and then they write a story about living in Maine. They become entranced by the area, and they come up time and time again. Mike and I, my husband and I, wound up going to Georgia a number of times. And at one time, the character Daffron actually came about through one of those experiences. And that was, we went to a country western bar. We're not really country western people, but the music sounded great, and we stopped in, and we were sitting around having a beer, and gentleman came and asked me if I would like to dance. So I got up to dance, and he wasn't so much of a gentleman. He was a Daffron. And it was, it was getting a little hard to shake him, and my husband was right there. And I thought to myself, he was very memorable. So he certainly influenced my characterization of this fellow in the book. But yeah, going down, we were there in the Barrier Islands, Tybee Island specifically, and did a lot of traveling around, hiking, and went back several times. After you start writing, you realize that you really need to get further data about plants and how people lived, and what did people's cabins look like, and could they really farm there? I mean, it was sand. So I went back with a notebook full of questions, and did research, talked to librarians down there, actually asked questions of people, and went around to cemeteries and read gravestones and got information off of gravestones, and collected plants and checked out the birds. I mean, it was just fascinating. It was an all-around experience. So yeah, I enjoyed it. Georgia is gorgeous. It still is. It's not romantic to me. I'm very intrigued by it. I'm very intrigued by the South, and maybe it's because it's just different, but it does intrigue me.
Well, thank you for that. I have only read your short stories and have just started Sunday's Orphan, but I really appreciate, I notice a lot of detail that you had even in the short stories, which makes it very convincing. Makes it, feels like you've been there.
Thank you. Phyllis.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you've had the opportunity yet or plan on it, doing readings in Georgia or in the South, and what kind of response you get from mixed races to the book.
It's a good question. I haven't ventured down there. I'm hiding out up here right now. I haven't done that yet. And you were actually my model, Phyllis, because I know you did a lot of work with libraries for your book. Phyllis is also an author, and a beautiful author who writes about her experiences with Alzheimer's. And in thinking about what you have done, and that is going to libraries, I thought I need to get going with contacting some Southern libraries to see if they would host me. So yeah, I will let you know. Maybe I'll have you come with me. But yeah, I'd like to do that. I have sent the story out to, when it was a short story, I did send it out to states other than Georgia for publication when I was looking to have the book published, the short story published. And it was interesting, the positive responses that I got. And some states, Mississippi in particular, asked me to write something about Mississippi. So I just found it very fascinating why they'd want a white kid from up north to be writing a book about down south. But, I don't know. So I don't know how people would respond down there, Phyllis. That will be very fascinating thing to find out. I did, however, I have to say this, I had 4 of my editors were from down south. And when you write, you have an editor that looks at the gestalt of what you're writing. So it's a developmental overview. You have an editor that looks at your punctuation, your spelling, that's a line editor. You have a fact checker. And I also had an editor who is a Black woman who edited it for sensitivity issues, which was entirely new to me. I had never heard of that before, but it's very prominent now when a person of one race writes about another race, that someone from that race reviews it to make sure that there's not an agenda there. And thankfully, my editor found no agenda, but all 4 of these editors were from down south, gave me some wonderful suggestions, which I incorporated into the book about, no, you really ought to look a little bit at this, and they wouldn't say this, and this is the word they'd use, or this is how that would happen. So those things helped a lot. And one person in particular was very happy that I did not do the typical Savannah, Georgia shtick about the magnolia trees and the beautiful blossoms and all that kind of stuff, which apparently is in its own way stereotypical of Savannah, which I hadn't really stopped to think about. So I got a lot of good feedback from those editors. Whether that would translate to readers being comfortable, I don't know.
Anybody else? Any other questions? I have a question just about your work with the e-zine that you're doing, the Together with Alzheimer's. Is that, it says you edit and publish a monthly magazine or monthly e-zine entitled Together with Alzheimer's,
Right.
that has subscribers throughout the United States. Is that something you started?
I started it after my mother died in 2013. At that time, she'd been ill for 13 years. And fortunately, my background is special education and mental health, and particularly in the residential treatment arena. I was an administrator in the residential treatment arena. So I was very familiar with working with integrated treatment modalities, psychiatrists, psychologists, OTs, PTs, that kind of stuff. So I was able to use what I knew about working in that modality with my mother's caregivers. And had I not had that background, however, I would have been lost, and I wouldn't have been able to really advocate for my mother the way we needed to, with the way she needed. And so in 2013, when she passed, I thought, let's take that information and do something with it. And if you had known my mom, she was always one to share information with people. She was a teacher at heart, and I thought, well, she'd probably bless this whole idea of, yeah, get the information out there. And if we can help other people get through this, let's do it. So I started the e-zine and bits and pieces of information. It's very short, big print, a lot of white space. Caregivers don't have time to do a lot of heavy duty reading. So if you can go down a page and pick up a few tips on what's going on and how best to incorporate some strategies into your daily living, it works for them. And at the same time started almost by accident a support group for caregivers who are dealing with spouses, parents who have dementia issues. And, you know, that's been going on for 8 years now too. So the need is out there for support for this group of people. And I know we have all been suffering with what we're calling the pandemic, but the Alzheimer's dementia arena is the real pandemic. It is virulent and it's out there, and we don't have any good ways of dealing with it once it hits. So I see it as a real issue for our society. But thank you for asking. So I got
Yeah.
on that course.
No, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Any,
Hey, Ray. So Ray, I'd like to say thank you for asking that, because I wanted to ask about that, but you're not here to talk about the Alzheimer's. You're here to talk about the book. My mother died in 2015 from Alzheimer's, from frontotemporal dementia. So I've been where you've been. I didn't know you existed in that arena. I run a caregiver support group for the Maine Alzheimer's Association here in Portland. But on the other hand, I had never heard of you as an author either. So I participate in Ray's events, and I'm intrigued, and I'll definitely get your book, and I'm interested in reading your past books. I'm an avid reader, so I'm so glad I attended tonight. Thank you.
Geez, Sally, I hope you share your email address so we can compare notes, because I have people coming in from, you know, contact me from Portland, and I never know who to connect them with. So yeah, we have things in common we need to share. My email's on my website, so please
Okay.
contact me.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
Yeah, that's great. Did Ray disappear? Now I can't hear you.
Ray, we can't hear you. We can't hear you. No. Okay, Catherine, you gotta take over for Ray.
Really? Did he lose audio entirely?
Yeah.
Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Okay, I'm sorry about that. So anything else? Is there anything that I wanted to tell you or ask you? Anything that you wanted to chat about? And it could be off the topic of Sunday's Orphan. I'm just looking at, you know, I'll just end with this. Part of the interesting thing about the racism, I get some information from, you know who Brian Stevenson is, the Black attorney who's been working with Black inmates on death row. He has a group called the Equal Justice Initiative, and it's quite interesting. Part of my research entailed seeing online the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which he's actually taken the names of all the people who were enslaved, and he has given them a memorial, each one of them. And you should really go online if you're interested in this area, but it's fascinating to see what he's done. And beside the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, he has the Legacy Museum. It's called From Slavery to Mass Incarceration. So he looks at the entire spectrum of what's been going on with segregation and all the issues in the United States. And so there's a calendar. that I get from him, from his organization. This is the front of it. And for every day of the year is identified some event that has happened in the arena of racial issues and segregation. Now, today's January 19th. So today on the 19th of January on this calendar, it says 1930. For 5 days, white mobs harass, beat, shoot, and destroy property of Filipino farm workers in Watsonville, California, following interracial dancing and economic competition. So I thought, wow, fantastic. I mean, just amazing. But 365 days of incidents of that nature over time, different years, have been identified on this calendar. So it's a type of thing I can't keep up on the wall because it's so depressing. But you know, it's real. It's just so real. So that was part of research also. Anyway, oh,
Do you
there's
recall this Brian Stevenson's book, the name of his book?
Just Mercy.
Yes, okay. I read it.
Yes.
Yes. It's a very good book.
Yes, it's very good. And I believe there was a movie out too. Just Mercy. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, and that was very good also. Yeah. You know, our mutual friend Jerry from dancing, his sister, who is now passed, but his sister worked in the justice arena, and she would try. I know she tried a couple times to get Brian Stevenson to come to her classes. She taught at I think it was Marymount down in Maryland. But she's working in that whole arena, and she was very, very active in it. And I know she had contact with Brian Stevenson. So yeah, she was an amazing lady. Are you back on, Ray? Hi, Jean.
Hi, I don't have a question. I just have to tell you that I just loved your book. I loved everything you've written, but it was an uncomfortable read, but it was so moving and so engaging. And I feel like it's such an important book. And I've asked the libraries around to order it, but I haven't had success yet. But I'm just in awe and so appreciative.
Oh, thanks, Jean. I appreciate your support over the years. You've been fantastic. Jean and Betty and I were in high school and college together, so we go back a long, long ways.
We do.
Yeah, thank you, Jean. That's lovely. You know, it's interesting. People had asked me about writing such a hard book, and I have to say, as hard as it was for you to read it, it was equally hard to write it. And I work with a writing group, and what they said to me was, when you write, if you open the book and you have a mantle, and on that mantle there's a gun, that's a signal to the reader that something's going to happen with that gun. So their logic was, when you open a book and you've got a character like Daphron show up and he's a murderer, you have got to show the reader the murder. And I was not going to do that because I just thought it was just too horrific. But I decided, you know, well, that's why you're in a writing group, because these people have more experience than you do. So you do it. And it was hard. It was not a pleasant thing to write about. It wasn't pleasant to research. And the interesting and the horrible thing is that what's in the book is milder than what actually happened in real life. So when you look to the research, it's amazing. It's just amazing. Anyway, you got the point. And that part was not fun to write. The rest of the book was an interesting thing to write. It was very challenging, but that was difficult. Thanks for sharing.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I don't know what happened, sorry. But thanks, Catherine. I mean, I'm happy to keep on going if you guys have any more questions. We're just gonna wrap up soon.
Anything else? I'm so excited that everybody came. I really appreciate it. And I love meeting people that I didn't know from before and seeing people that I've known forever and seeing Richard on the West Coast. Is he still there? So, yeah, there he is. So I haven't seen Richard. in
Damn,
years.
that's not the Maine coast. That's the Sonoma coast.
That's right. Absolutely. You look right at home there, Richard. It's good to see you. Very good to see. Oh, look at here's Eddie and Marie. Oh my God. Have you been here all along?
Yes.
Oh, you didn't say hello earlier. So good to see you.
I didn't want you to sign off if I said hello.
You want me to hang up right away? Okay. And Paul is a neighbor, so I don't see Paul's face, but that's okay. There you are. Hi, Paul. Thank you for coming. Let's see, and who is it? SCGA 70. Is that my husband? No, somebody's back there. So, yeah, I really appreciate everybody coming. It's so delightful. It really makes me feel warm and fuzzy inside. Good to see everybody.
Good to see you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, everyone. And again, I do this every third Wednesday of the month, so you can always email me for Zoom links. Next is Robert or Bob Key's doing Robert Indiana's The Isolation Artist on February 16th. Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you, Ray. It's been a delight meeting you and seeing everybody this evening. Thank you much.
All right.
Thank
Take care
you.
all.
Thank you,
Thank
Catherine.
you.